Okay, so good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to this innovation workshop in collaboration with Ergomed. And the topic for today's session is going to be looking at maximising drug development in the area of rare disease. So, of course, a very important topic indeed, as it represents a high area of unmet need and potentially could open up opportunities along the way for treatments in more common areas of disease as well. So I'll shortly hand over to Zizi, who's going to be presenting to us today. And before I do so, I just want to say, if you're not presenting, please remain muted with camera off, but we'd be delighted to take your questions and answers in the chat box, which has been enabled. And as you will have heard, we are recording the session so that we can make it available as part of the conference on demand content that can be accessed via the conference app. So with this, I'm going to hand to Zizi, who's Senior Vice President of Global Strategy and Development at Ergomed. Thank you for joining us, Zizi, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be presenting on this topic, innovations and approaches to accelerating drug development. I'm going to focus a lot on rare disease in this particular presentation for a couple of reasons. Again, we usually like to put a disclaimer slide to say that these are, my views, not Ergomed's views, and the intellectual property of myself as a presenter are protected under copyright laws. I think that we've already received some housekeeping notes, and again, we'll have time for questions, and I'm happy to take any questions that come up. A quick introduction. Again, my name is Zizi Matabebe. As she said, I'm a Senior Vice President for Global Strategy and Development. I also head our Rare Disease Innovation Center. I've been in the industry now for about 32 plus years now, and my background really spans across the drug development life cycle, really spanning from early development to clinical development, commercial, and then consulting. Part of my role is to work very closely with many biotechnology or pharmaceutical companies, especially as they bring in drugs into market. So we work very closely with them to make sure we understand what the challenges are and how to provide a solution. So in this, we're always challenged by making sure we can provide the right innovations or the right approaches that will help them make their drug development program a success. And so some of this presentation is really going to come from experience and a lot of things that we've seen helpful, especially in this space for these companies, hence the presentation. I'm also a published book author in the rare disease space. I'm a subject matter expert. I speak at various conferences and events, and I really try to stay current on various innovations and approaches that are happening right now in the field. I'm also, sorry, I think I just skipped a slide. I'm also very active, involved in looking at how we can leverage innovations and how we can build different types of solutions, including decentralized trials, which we're going to talk about as well. I lead Ergomed's Rare Disease Innovation Center and previously led rare disease initiatives at other large companies and major CROs as well. I've also been involved in developing and commercializing over 25 pharmaceutical products and medical devices. So this is just a brief background about myself and just the basis for which this presentation is coming from. I'm going to go over a quick overview of the rare disease, the market itself, and why we're focusing on innovations for rare disease in this instance, and then talk about the innovations that we have found to accelerate drug development, and then tell you a bit about our Ergomed Rare Disease Innovation Center and how it actually helps our companies to accelerate their drug development, and wrap up and then questions. Okay, in terms of rare disease overview, quick facts about rare disease. Rare diseases really are defined based on the area that they occur in. But the most interesting thing or the most common thing about rare diseases is that they are rare. They are disorders that are not very common, especially when you compare them to the population in which the patients are in. In the US, it's any disorder that affects fewer than 200,000 people. In Europe, it's about 1 in 2,000 people, any illness that affects 1 in 2,000 people. Currently, about 300 million people globally have a rare disease. That's about the population of the US. So even though they are rare, there's still a lot of people globally that have rare diseases. Now, with most rare diseases, over half of them are in children. And the ironic thing about that is that of the children that do have rare diseases, a third of them will not live to see their fifth birthday. The reason is because most rare diseases are often misdiagnosed, and it can take an average of 5 to 7 years to get the right diagnosis for rare diseases. As you mentioned earlier on, this is an area of very high unmet need because only about 5% of rare diseases have any form of treatment. So 95% of rare diseases do not have any treatment, which means that it's really important that we can leverage innovations. We can bring in solutions that will help us accelerate drug development in this space. So there is a critical and an urgent need for utilizing innovations to really bring these drugs to market very quickly, especially when you think about the fact that, again, it impacts children, and many of these children will actually die before they're actually correctly diagnosed. In terms of the rare disease market, I talked about the unmet need and with the fact that there's only 5%. So there's been a lot of activity in this area, which is part of the reason that I focus this presentation on rare diseases, because they are so challenging to develop. Usually, if you can leverage this approach, the rare disease approach, very successfully, you can use it in most indications. The other thing too is that with rare diseases, they cover all therapeutic indications. So rare disease is not just one indication, but it covers oncology, it covers CNS, it covers metabolic diseases, and so many other therapeutic areas. So a real firm handle on how to leverage innovations in rare disease really affects most of drug development. So I hope that's really clear from that. Um, in terms of the market, again, the US accounts for over 50% of the market, and it's about a $5 to $6 billion market for rare disease. Oncology right now is somewhere in the 10 to 15 billion dollars. So you can see that it's a huge market, huge need, and huge need for innovation in this space. In terms of growth, the rare disease clinical development market is growing at an average of about 12 to 14%, while the average drug development on non-rare grows at about 6 to 7%. So that's almost double. Again, a lot of activity in this space and a huge need for innovation and innovative approaches for rare disease drug development. So now I want to speak about the innovations that accelerate rare disease and other drug development. Some of the key innovations, I've selected some of the key ones that we're seeing right now, especially in this space. Some of them include decentralized trials, precision medicine, artificial intelligence, digital health, and real-world evidence. So we're going to focus on these particular key innovations. There are others, but these are some of the primary ones that really impact rare diseases and most other drug development. Decentralized trials have been defined by CTTI as a means to which clinical trials really are brought closer to the patient as opposed to patient coming to the trials. And decentralized trials are trials that are executed through various means, and again, that are different from the more traditional ones. In most clinical trials, you have patients going to traditional clinical sites where they visit a physician who actually does treatment, does the test on site, etc. but especially with the impact of COVID over the last 2 years, there's been a need for trials to be more virtual, so to speak, and more um, easily accessible by patients. So when you speak about decentralized trials really include various components, not just one. It ranges from things such as electronically consenting, where patients can consent without actually being in the site and to do the study, and they can do that electronically, or by using telemedicine, where patients don't have to actually come to the site, but they can stay at their homes, their place of work, or any other place that's not at the site, and they can visit with their physicians and receive care. Also, through decentralized trials, we've been able to bring patients supplies such as their medications, etc., to their homes through various means, such as direct shipment. It has also expanded the use of home nursing, home care, where you actually have health providers coming to the home to perform tests or follow up on patients, as opposed to the patients coming to the site. And so what this has done, obviously, is that especially when you think about like rare diseases where the patients are few and far between and sometimes have to travel great distances just to get treatment, it has reduced the need for travel, for patients and caregivers. And also remember, we talked about the fact that most rare diseases include patients, include children. So you're talking about families that are often have to travel. So this has been, quite helpful because, the need for travel has been reduced. It has also increased protocol compliance because then, when you create various aspects such as minimizing the number of visits or having visits done in home, for example, patients are more likely to be more compliant with a particular protocol because they see the protocol as being very patient friendly for them, and that improves patient recruitment and also engaging the patient in the trial. With decentralized trial as well, we're also able to collect real world evidence in real time, which is also helpful as well, because real world evidence is another huge area where we can get data that helps the acceleration of the drug development for that particular asset. So in general, decentralized trials have been extremely helpful, not just for patients and for their caregivers, but also helpful for sites because it helps to reduce their site costs and really in some ways also helps to reduce um, cost of clinical trials because some of the components are being able to be virtualized. The next component I want to talk about is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a means where we can leverage big data, machine learning, for example, to really help us in drug development. For example, with rare diseases, for example, over 80% of them have a genetic mutation. So with artificial intelligence, we're able to use machine learning, we're able to use big data, for example, to identify like point mutations, which are very common with rare diseases. So this helps to improve diagnosis because with treating a lot of these diseases, there's a huge challenge in accurately diagnosing the disease because many rare diseases appear as something else. And there's so many different systems in the body that are involved in a rare disease that the diagnosis is often very difficult. So having and being able to leverage artificial intelligence to improve diagnosis is especially helpful. The other thing that artificial intelligence is able to do is being able to determine the best treatment um, for or the best clinical trial for patients. Leveraging big data, machine learning through artificial intelligence, we're able to look at a particular course of treatment and see, based on this data, based on this algorithm, what do we think the best treatment path is for the patient? Again, think about just how helpful and how important that is when you can leverage that kind of information, especially when you're dealing with diseases that are so complex. The other thing that artificial intelligence can help to do is to speed the enrollment process. Through artificial intelligence as well, we can leverage various types of data again to identify patients in a very smart way, looking at various data sets, looking at EHR, for example, which are electronic health records, to more accurately pinpoint where these patients are and inform them about clinical trials that they can be a part of. This helps obviously to speed up the enrollment and again to increase or to accelerate the drug development process and hereby bringing that drug quicker to market. Artificial intelligence also helps us to optimize digital health, and I'll talk a little bit about digital health technologies. I think in today's environment, for example, we're seeing a lot of people using Fitbits, wearables, etc. So people are very health conscious and using a lot of digital devices. Well, artificial intelligence can also help to leverage some of the information that we're getting from the digital technologies that we're using to inform treatment, to inform quality of life, for example, and also to inform progression, for example, of disease. I talked also about digital health briefly, and I would probably segue to this. With digital health, for example, these include things like wearables. We've talked about some of the watches, sensors, smartphones. A lot of things can be done now digitally. It's not uncommon for patients to be able to monitor their blood pressure or ECGs, for example, done digitally. This is extremely, extremely helpful because with digital health, it doesn't limit the patients, for example, to going to a site, for example, to have these measurements collected. They can be collected on the go, and it also, again, increases compliance for the patients, increases quality of life, and minimizes disruptions in their daily living. These are just some examples of different things that can be measured through these technologies, like I mentioned, heart rate, etc. The use of digital health is very important as an important innovative approach because it also helps to accelerate time to market because now we're able to collect various measures, sometimes on a very continuous basis, which maybe, again, we had to have the patient come into the site or come to a facility to collect. And then again, it makes it more patient-centric for patients to be able to participate in the drug development. Also, real-world evidence. I mentioned the use of real-world evidence, and real-world evidence is really evidence that's collected in real time, and it's collected from various sources really over time. And with real-world evidence, we can identify and various aspects. It helps us to find the right patients, for example. We can leverage with real world evidence, you're really leveraging various data sources to help you get information. So that's how we can identify patients. If we're looking at even health records, with the rare disease space, we're often challenged because we don't really know what the right biomarkers to use sometimes are. The illness or the indication is so new that we haven't identified what the biomarkers are. But with real world evidence, you can conduct various types of studies, such as natural history studies, for example, where you can look at the progression of the patient over a period of time and collect various measures, assessments from them. And in that way, it really informs the drug development process because you have a better understanding of, again, what types of patients are involved in that indication, what kind of biomarkers, what we need to be looking for, what type of endpoints, what should we be looking at as an endpoint, for example, to measure the disease progression or to measure whether or not this disease is being treated in a appropriate way. Real world evidence helps us to be able to do that. Real-world evidence also helps us to be able to leverage synthetic control arms. Synthetic control arms are examples of um, you know, controls that are not actual patients. Like usually when you do a clinical trial, it's a randomized trial and you get a placebo. And these placebo patients are not, um, you know, they may not, they're not given the drug, for example. Now in the rare disease space, I talked about the fact that half of rare disease patients are children. Now in the US, it's really considered unethical to do a placebo controlled study for children, especially in rare disease, where again, when we think about 30% of children dying before their fifth birthday, so manufacturers are under a lot of pressure, especially from patient advocacy groups, to look at other ways of including controls that don't include actual patients, especially children. And real world evidence helps us to be able to do that. In fact, that's one of the strongest aspects that real world evidence can help us with, whereby we can look at various types of data and try to find data that's a comparator for that particular placebo that we are intending to use. And many of the regulatory agencies, for example, the FDA, EMA, for example, will provide guidance as to the use of those control arms if the data is comparable. Again, real world evidence can help to speed up recruitment because, again, you've got natural history studies that you're looking at collecting data from various sources, being able to more readily identify and pinpoint patients that might be helpful for this particular study. I mentioned again that the FDA and most regulatory agencies will accept historical data for using real world for using drug development. And this is extremely helpful. There are a number of new drugs that have come out most recently that have leveraged a lot of real world evidence to be able to um, come to market in a very quick way. Precision medicine is another innovation that is extremely helpful in drug development. In precision medicine, you're essentially trying to identify subpopulations in that particular indication. And you see this a lot in a lot of the oncology, a lot of rare cancers, and even a lot of more popular illnesses that are not typically rare, even diabetes or some forms of epilepsy, some other treatments where you look at very, very small subpopulations. And what that helps drug developers be able to do is they're able to more accurately target their drug for that particular population. So you're able to find or treat the right patients when you can classify the subpopulation um, as best as possible based on how susceptible they can be to that particular drug. Also, we're also able to, through precision medicine, is to be able to identify which patient will benefit most, right? From this particular treatment option or treatment algorithm. Precision medicine helps us be able to do that. And also to help us determine what the right target patient profile is. Making sure that we are matching the right patient with the right indication. So precision medicine is another innovative approach that can be utilized, and it's being utilized currently for drug development. Also wanted to take some time to speak quickly about Ergomed Rare Disease Innovation Center and also how it helps sponsors, biopharmaceutical companies to accelerate their rare disease and their other drug development. One of the things, the driving factors for us in developing the Innovation Center was because we looked a lot at the challenges involved with rare disease drug development. As I mentioned previously, we're talking about very, very small populations. We're talking about diseases that are not often defined, that involve many different systems, and also physicians that maybe have limited experience in treating these diseases. Don't forget that there are over 7,000 rare diseases and only 5% have any form of treatment. So this is a very challenging area. So based on the various challenges that apply, with some of which I have mentioned with rare diseases, we looked at various ways which we could help solve for these challenges, and we developed an innovation center to help us be able to do that. So again, I talked a bit again about the challenges, um, that rare diseases pose here, and the fact that these diseases are very poorly understood as well. The other thing, again, I want to reiterate with this is that when you think about a rare disease, think about a rare disease as a family disease. Again, half of rare diseases are in children. So when a child is affected by rare disease, the whole family usually is. And many times, because these diseases are genetic, there's often some hereditary component. There might be other family members that have this disease. So again, you can see we're dealing with an area that's very challenging and requires a lot of thought, a lot of innovation, and a lot of approaches to help solve. Our Rare Disease Innovation Center is a consortium of um, industry leading partners that are focused on providing cutting edge and innovative solutions, as well as some of our internal subject matter experts. And what the Innovation Center does is that we provide tailored solutions. So, for example, we will look at a sponsor, for example, a biotech or biopharmaceutical company that's looking to develop an asset or a compound for a particular indication. And we'll look at all the various challenges that are inherent or unique for that particular particular patient's indication or that particular patient group. And based on that, we will develop tailored solutions to be able to solve. Again, I mentioned that we provide, we work with various partners. So we have very niche providers, for example, that provide various types of solutions. One of the things that we provide is what we call intelligent clinical trials. And with intelligent clinical trials, what we essentially do is that we leverage data, we leverage artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, to really identify where to find these patients, what the best countries, what the best sites, for example, are for these patients. One of the big challenges with rare disease, again, is finding the right patients. So being able to leverage this kind of technology, for example, is very, very helpful to pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, for example, so that it helps them to really speed up enrollment because they can more intelligently and more strategically pinpoint which countries, which sites, what the enrollment metrics really are based on leveraging technology and data from various sources to help them make really smart decisions. We also are able to find patients using various types of technologies. I mentioned, for example, that a number of rare diseases affect are genetic in origin. We're able to leverage various types of genetic testing, lab testing, digital and social media, for example, to identify or closely pinpoint the types of patients that we need for that particular study. And with that identification of patients, we also provide a lot of tools and applications and technology to help these patients stay engaged with the clinical trial so that they don't drop out. The other thing that we also do is we also help to be able to identify what the medical ecosystem around that particular indication looks like. In the rare disease space, for example, it takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years to actually diagnose. And during the process of diagnosis, a patient can see anywhere from 4 to 7 different physician specialties, just trying to find the right treatment. So through our method that we use here, through our referral method, we identify who the treating physician is for that particular indication. And then we identify who the referring physicians are for the particular indication. And throughout the enrollment of that particular clinical trial, for example, we will perform various outreaches to that ecosystem so that they are aware of that particular trial, and it helps to increase the enrollment and increase the awareness of the trial in that particular area, which is very helpful. And remember again that a lot of patients are waiting for new drugs, so being innovative in this way to increase the awareness of clinical trials that are happening is extremely helpful and beneficial to patients. We also provide an optimized clinical delivery model through our Innovation Center, where we have what we call, for example, our site advantage that works very closely with the clinical sites, patient advocacy groups, for example, to make sure that we can successfully deliver this study so that this study or this product comes out into the market as quickly as possible. I talked a bit about decentralized trials. We especially look at decentralized trials and look at a clinical trial, for example, and see what aspects of this clinical trial can be decentralized, especially when we're dealing with families. Do these patients need this many tests? Do they need to come in this many times? Are there a number of visits that can be done in the home, for example, so that it minimizes the travel of the patient? Can these patients consent electronically? Can we have some telemedicine visits, for example? So we take a look at the protocol for clinical trials and make sure that we can look at aspects of that clinical trial that can be decentralized so that we can enroll patients and ultimately accelerate the drug development and bring the drug to market. I talked a bit about real world evidence, so I won't dwell as much on it here. But the idea is, again, leveraging real world evidence, leveraging data to help us gather information that will help us either with creating external control arms or just getting information about the patient journey, the natural history of that particular indication. The voice of the patient is another important part. We also work with various groups that can easily provide the voice of the patient. You know, when you're providing, for example, doing a clinical study, for example, you want to be sure that that protocol is optimized. By that, I mean that the patients feel like the study is not burdensome to them, that the patients also feel like the endpoints that are being measured are endpoints that are going to be useful to them. The FDA, for example, has the 21st Century Skills Act, which requires that as part of the submission process for final marketing authorization, that the sponsor has included the voice of the patient. So making sure that the voice of the patient is included in drug development is an innovative approach, an important approach to really helping to accelerate that drug development and showing to the authorities, especially the regulatory authorities, that the sponsor has taken that extra step to make sure that the voice of the patient and caregivers is incorporated. Another important aspect is working with patient advocacy groups. Patient advocacy groups are especially powerful in the rare disease space, and they've been a powerful force actually in a number of key indications and have lent their voice to actually having drugs approved because of the power that they hold and the number of advocates that they work with and just how tied they are with the community. So working very closely with patient advocacy groups, best identifying who the patient advocacy groups are for that particular indication is important. Looking at various ways that a sponsor can work with them is really important, and leveraging the resources that they have is especially important and beneficial for patients, as well as helpful to bringing these drugs to market really quickly. Okay. I just wanted to show just really quickly, high level, how we can integrate the Innovation Center with patient identification For example, when we have have leveraged various technologies where we look like an on-screening pre-tool that we have, where we can use digital technology to identify patients. The patients, screen online, for example, and through, for example, our own site advantage, which I mentioned, our operational delivery model, we're able to work with these patients that are being screened and with these sites that are being screened to make sure that the site can follow up really quickly on patients that are being screened to get them quickly involved in study. So site advantage is part of the Ergomed Innovation Center, but it's really integrates into the various aspects of work that we have, such as patient recruitment, making sure that there's a good handoff from patients that are being screened onto the sites. The same thing again with the patient concierge process, which is trying to make sure that we can help patients, for example, get into the studies, to their locations, for example, either through arranging transportation for them or telehealth, for example, mobile health, for example. Our Ergomed site advantage is embedded the process as well to make sure that there's a good follow through. Okay, and with that, I want to wrap up. I wanted to really have more of a discussion and keep the presentation as concise as possible so I can take any additional questions or comments. So with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Susie. That was absolutely fascinating, so interesting. Highlighted so many key topics that we are sort of seeing at the forefront of innovation. So artificial intelligence, precision medicine, real world evidence. So all of these really important enablers that are helping to accelerate drug discovery. So I will invite attendees, if they have any questions, to use the chat box. If it's easier to turn your camera on, then I'm more than happy for you to do that, and I can pick your questions up that way. But whilst we wait, I do have a few questions myself. So it's part of the Innovation Centre that you presented on towards the end of your presentation, you highlighted as part of the consortium quite a number of stakeholders and players and partners. What do you think are the important relationships that need building in our ecosystem? Is that between industry and patient groups, or industry and academia? What work do you think we have to do to improve that?
I think there's a lot of work that can be done, but one of the biggest things, obviously, I think, is between patients and industry, because it's kind of like you're trying to develop something for me, but you need to understand if that works kind of for me. A good example is a couple of years ago we had a drug that a rare disease drug for actually Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and when that drug was being reviewed, it was actually rejected initially. And it was rejected because the regulatory agencies felt that it wasn't meeting the clinical endpoints that they had set up. But the patient groups felt that the patients were seeing improvement in their daily living, right, in their activities of daily living, and that these changes, however incremental they were beneficial to them and improved their quality of life. So the patient advocacy groups actually lobbied with the regulatory agencies, and that decision was reversed and the drug was put on the market. So I think we want to see more collaboration between the industry and really the patients and the patient groups, so that the voice of the patient is really represented, and that we're not just looking at endpoints that are just clinical, but we're also looking at endpoints that are also meaningful for the patient as well. Because if the drug succeeds in improving the quality of life for that patient in a measurable way, then for those patients it's a success, because they're doing something that they could probably not do before, or something that has minimized the risk to them, or help them or their families to be able to be more effective in just their daily living.
I think that's, yeah, really important in that in order to understand what benefits the patient, sometimes you have to be a patient yourself. So yeah, really, really important there. Alan, you've turned your camera on, so over to you.
Yes, just I thought rather than using the chat when we're a smaller group, thank you very much, first of all, for a very comprehensive and in-depth review of sort of global aspects of the rare disease approach needed to get treatment, if that's bad English, but you know what I mean. And a couple of questions linked to that. You mentioned that the largest single market was the US, accounting for about half of the market. Is that based on commercial sales values or volume? Because my thought was many, particularly in Asia, the countries are working with a more limited budget, but there might be the numbers. So is that figure related to the sales value in the US?
Okay, so it's related to a couple of things. Related to the sales value, obviously, because the US is the biggest market. It's also related to the number of studies that are being done right now. So if you look at the number of studies, currently about 60% of all the rare disease studies are being done actually in the US. And there's a lot of reasons for wanting to do studies in the US, right? We've got the FDA, our orphan drug designation. The FDA is actually extremely very friendly. And because we know the FDA realizes that there's such an unmet need, they're no longer, we should say the FDA and look at them as a big bad wolf, but now they're really very friendly in their approach. I mean, they've got different types of pathways to help you get fast track, for example, pathways, and different types of pathways that they have. So a lot of companies really like to come into the US when they do drug development. The other thing again, why we think there's a huge growth in the US is the fact that when you're doing drug development, and this is also from experience as well, you're more likely to get to your first patient in the US than you are anywhere else on average, right? Because of just the efficiencies that are built into the system. And then when you think about the different types of developments that are going on, and when you're looking at more esoteric type development, like advanced therapies, for example, gene therapies and things like that, a lot of sponsors like to come to the US, come to the Western EU, for example, to do this. But yes, it is driven by the dollars, in terms of revenue, but it's also driven by the actual drug development work itself. That's happening right now.
Thank you. And as you know, in focusing on Asia, some countries like Japan, Korea, and also Australia have specific orphan drug regulations and requirements, whereas China still hasn't defined it. Do you still do a number of studies, including patients in China, because of the sheer scale and number of patients?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's really interesting. I was just talking with Amy, one of our colleagues. The thing with rare diseases is that, some ethnicities or some areas, that's why it's rare. Some are more prevalent in other areas. Like I have a rare disease I'm working on right now. It's prevalent in the US, EU, but it's also very prevalent in China as well. So you're going to have those situations. So, many times when that happens, of course, patients or the sponsors, especially when they're getting closer to like a phase 3 or then they have to go into China or Japan or Korea, for example, because they're trying to expand the reach of that particular drug. But maybe early on, if you're doing early development first, disease, you might obviously focus, say, in the US because you're trying to get your first patient in as quickly as possible, or focus in the EU. But as you expand, you have to go into those countries. So yes.
And if I may just add another question, I don't want to steal the time. As you know, there's often for these rare diseases either patient or family associations who look after and try to promote the interests of, say, their children or their relatives. Do you work also with such organisations? There's very often for rare diseases a particular association that are trying to help people with that particular disease, no matter how limited it is in numbers. If it's as you know, if you're affected, it's 100% usually.
That's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I mentioned when I said the patient advocacy groups. So usually when someone gets diagnosed with a rare disease, because it's kind of rare, one of the first things that they do is they try to find, is there anybody else that has this disease, and are there any groups that have been set up? Because they are trying to understand it themselves. And by the time they are actually diagnosed with that disease, it's not immediate. It's taking sometimes a couple of years, unless there's a family history and they have had a prior diagnosis. For example, maybe it's a family history where, there's a family history of Duchenne or something like that. But if it's something that is uncommon, then it's taking them a long time. So one of the first things they do is to find the patient advocacy groups. And so a lot of these patient advocacy groups are very powerful. Sometimes you have what are very ultra rare diseases where you have maybe 100 people in the globe that have that illness. That's even then more difficult. So it helps them band together. It helps them have a more unified voice. And they also are a powerful lobby for the regulatory agencies. So we find that it's important to really work with the patient advocacy, not just to understand, right? Because you want to seek to understand what these patients are going through, what the needs are, how are they being treated currently, and what do they not like about the way they're being treated? What treatment, what new treatment makes the most sense for them? And they can help with this kind of information. So they can really help you understand the patient better, but they can also help be a powerful lobby for the with the regulatory agencies. So that relationship is extremely important. Many times also, I have to say, some of them are fairly small. So a lot of them also now belong to, various umbrella organizations. I know in the US we have a number of larger umbrella organizations where some of these small groups belong to as well, to give them some coverage, some guidance, some help with some of the logistics and infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you for participating there. That's brilliant. And Zizi, you mentioned one of the first factors was decentralized trials. So
yes.
Obviously the benefits of virtual trials, reduction in costs, more accessibility, but what are the challenges and what have been done to address those?
Well, when you look at, the challenge is that, for example, when you're going to the EU, for example, and you take something like e-consent. So e-consent is, you can consent electronically anyway, right? So you say you want to do the study and you can sign on a tablet or something, you're going to do the study. In the EU, because of GDPR and various regulations, there are some areas that still don't accept e-consent, right? Or they will accept the e-consent, but they want to have a wet signature as well. So there are, data privacy issues, obviously, in certain areas, especially in the EU, when in certain countries of the EU, with decentralization, for example.
Thank you. And do you think is sort of kind of patient compliance an issue if you're off-site? I know you stated it as kind of a benefit, but is there a risk of patient compliance if they're off-site?
Yeah, absolutely, because there's a risk of patient compliance if, say, for example, the patient is in a particular study and then, they have to come, 2 or 3 times a week. You now remember, assuming this is someone who's working, that's a lot of time away from work, right? To leave 2 or 3 times a week or even twice a week to drive or go 60 miles, because they said on average, it's, an average patient lives about 60 miles from the site. To drive maybe 60 miles or go 60 miles to one site just to get care. So that's a long, way. So how you want to minimize that, you incorporate elements of decentralization and patient centricity. Can you have a home health nurse, for example, come to draw blood if they need to draw blood or do some other test? Can they do telemedicine so they don't have to disrupt their daily living? And that's helpful for them. Can you make it more patient friendly for them instead of trying to figure out how to get to the site and pay their own transportation, etc.? Can you provide transportation and reimburse them and give them meals, things like that for themselves and their families, to get to that? So yeah, patient compliance is an issue, especially when the study is demanding. And there are a number of studies that can be demanding. A lot of protocols these days are actually quite complex. So it's really important that the patient's centricity and the comfort of the patient is taken into mind.
Excellent, thank you. And sort of just zooming out a little bit. So obviously, I think you highlighted genetic causes as sort of, or genetics as being sort of one of the key kind of factors in sort of rare disease, often the root cause. So what, in your perspective, what are sort of the biggest enablers to have to us as an industry advancing our understanding of sort of genetics? What sort of technologies and advances do you think are going to really accelerate that area of our industry?
Well, I think that, I talked about precision medicine. That's very helpful. There's also a new, it's interesting, I'm actually speaking next week I'm hosting a panel next week at the World and Congress, and this is one of the things that we're talking about. There's also the new CRISPR technology. There are lots of gene editing technologies, gene splicing technologies. So there's a lot of work that has been, a lot of technologies that have actually come up in this space that are extremely important and are really making a difference in terms of diagnosis and also treatment of diseases.
Excellent, thank you. Sounds encouraging. And I can't see any other questions, so I might just finalize with this one. So obviously, so bringing it back to sort of the One Nucleus perspective, in our network, we have a range of companies, different sizes. Does Ergomed have sort of a structure in place to work with companies of different sizes, large and small, if they want to collaborate or use your services?
Yes, absolutely. Ergomed works with various types of companies, small and large companies. We work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies. Our primary key areas, we work in the rare disease space, we work in oncology, and also in the CNS space in particular. Ergomed started as a co-development company, so we used to actually work developing compounds with small biotech companies, but we have evolved from that. We're a 25-year-old company. We leverage innovations and various approaches. So we're always very happy to hear from companies that are interested in bringing a new drug into the market and really helping them walk through the process and making sure they have the right solutions and the right strategies to help them be successful.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Zizi, thank you so much for presenting to us today. That was really, really interesting. And to all the delegates on the line, thank you so much for joining, and to those participating, thank you very much for your questions. Please feel free to use the conference app to continue the discussion and connect with Zizi. And with that, I'd also just like to do a quick mention that obviously our in-person on Helix conference is taking place tomorrow at Babraham. So for those attending, I really look forward to seeing you there. It's going to be a really exciting day with lots of panel presentations and networking opportunities, and you can continue your partnering in person. So with that, I'd just like to thank Zizi once again and bring the session to a close. Thank you all very much and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.